Galena, Illinois, October 1881. The wind sweeping through the lead hills already carried the scent of iron and the promise of a brutal winter. Along the curve of a muddy track, a cluster of abandoned lime kilns stood like forgotten fortifications against the low gray sky. Most settlers saw them as useless relics of a played-out boom, hollow stone bottles good for nothing but sheltering stray livestock. But one man saw something else. Anton Pirc was inside the largest of the kilns, a 22-foot conical structure of rough-laid limestone, his hammer and chisel ringing with a patient, rhythmic clarity. He wasn't tearing it down. He was cleaning it out, preparing it for habitation. From the road above, two riders reined in their horses. One was Jedediah Smith, a farmer whose opinion was as solid and unyielding as the frozen ground of his fields. The other was Mercer Halloway, the county tax assessor, a man who measured the world in board feet and taxable improvements. "Still at it, is he?" Smith grunted, shaking his head. "The man's a fool, trying to raise a family in a rock pile. It'll be a tomb by January." Halloway watched, his face a mask of official skepticism. He had dealt with stubborn men before, but this was different. This wasn't stubbornness. It was a quiet, methodical madness. He had already warned Pirc that the structure was an industrial ruin, not a homestead. He could see the man's wife, Katerina, nearby, gathering fallen branches, her face betraying a mixture of hope and deep-seated worry. The whole endeavor was foolish, an invitation to disaster. "It's a defiance of common sense," Halloway said, more to himself than to Smith. "He's building a grave and calling it a home." What did this Slovenian stove builder, this quiet immigrant with calloused hands and a strange accent, understand about the physics of delayed thermal mass that the most experienced carpenters and assessors in the lead hills had missed? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would rewrite the rules of survival in this unforgiving landscape. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of the thermal battery, a concept that modern architects celebrate, but which this frontier innovator understood in his bones. Before we uncover that secret, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell. We explore the lost wisdom of the past, and your support makes it possible. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Anton Pirc was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, pitched a roof, or laid a clapboard in his life. He was not a farmer, accustomed to the cycles of soil and season. In his homeland, in the hilly region of Carniola in Slovenia, he had been a pechar, a builder of the great masonry stoves, the pech, that formed the warm, beating heart of every home. His hands knew the language of fire brick and clay mortar, the precise curve of a flue, the heft of a glazed ceramic tile. His mind worked in terms of heat, not shelter. He didn't think about keeping the cold out. He thought about inviting the heat in and persuading it to stay. He had arrived in Illinois with his wife Katerina and their two small children, Luca and Anna, drawn by the promise of land and the letters from distant cousins who spoke of opportunity. They had spent their savings on a small plot of land and a hastily constructed board and batten shack, the standard frontier starter home. Their first winter, the winter of 1880, had been a lesson in failure. Anton was a man who understood heat, and he found himself in a house that seemed designed to defy it. The cold was not a visitor. It was a resident. It lived in the walls, in the floor, under the door. He remembered the simple, brutal facts of that winter. He remembered the lamp oil in the basin thickening to a sluggish gel by midnight, the flames sputtering and shrinking. He remembered the lid of the nail keg by the door, where they kept their meager supply of flour, being frost-welded shut, requiring a blow from a hammer to break it free. Most painfully, he remembered Katerina's despair. For 3 consecutive nights she had tried to make bread, the familiar comfort of their old life. Each morning, the dough was a cold, lifeless lump in the bowl. It refused to rise. The yeast, like their hopes, had surrendered to the cold. The house was a sieve, and the fire in their small cast-iron stove was a frantic, roaring waste. It burned through their woodpile at an astonishing rate, yet its heat was a fleeting thing, a temporary victory in a war they were constantly losing. The air an inch from the stove could be blistering, while 10 feet away a cup of water would form a skin of ice. That spring, his family having survived on luck and resilience alone, Anton walked his land. He saw the derelict lime kiln not as a ruin, but as a solution. He saw it not with the eyes of a carpenter, but with the eyes of a pichar. He saw a giant, ready-made masonry stove waiting for a master's touch. To understand Anton's genius, one must first understand the profound failure of the structures around him. The conventional log cabins and frame houses of the Illinois frontier were built on a principle of insulation, but the materials and methods were entirely inadequate. The problem wasn't the cold. The problem was physics. A standard frontier cabin relied on the insulating properties of wood. A wall of hewn logs, 6 to 8 inches thick, or a frame wall made of 1-inch pine boards, was the only barrier against the outside. Wood is a decent insulator. It resists the transfer of heat, but it possesses almost no thermal mass. Thermal mass is a material's ability to absorb, store, and then slowly release heat energy. Wood has very little. The moment the fire in the stove died down, the minimal heat stored in the wooden walls dissipated into the night. The temperature inside the cabin began to plummet, seeking to equalize with the crushing cold outside. This created a cycle of frantic effort. A family's entire day could be consumed by the battle for warmth. The father and older sons would spend hours felling trees and chopping wood. The mother and children were tasked with constantly feeding the stove. The heat produced was immediate, but ephemeral. A roaring fire would heat the air in the room through convection, but the walls, floor, and ceiling remained cold. This led to a miserable living condition. Hot, stuffy air near the ceiling, frigid drafts along the floor. Occupants felt simultaneously scorched on one side and frozen on the other. Mercer Halloway, in his capacity as assessor, had seen the grim results dozens of times. He'd seen the telltale signs of a failing house, the thick layer of frost coating the nail heads inside the walls, where the cold conducted straight through the iron. He'd seen the desperate measures families took, stuffing the gaps between logs with rags, mud, even precious newspaper, fighting a losing war against infiltration. The wind didn't just blow against these houses, it blew through them. A flickering candle flame was the frontiersman's best draft detector. In most cabins, it danced and guttered no matter where you placed it. This constant exchange of air meant they weren't just heating a room, they were attempting to heat the entire state of Illinois. The cost was measured not just in cords of wood, but in health. The damp, drafty cold settled in the lungs, bringing relentless coughs. Children suffered from chilblains, their fingers and toes swollen and painfully itchy. The frontier wasn't just a test of spirit, it was a brutal test of thermodynamics, and most settlers were failing. Anton Pirc began his work in the late summer, giving himself until the first hard frost. His project became a source of local amusement and morbid curiosity. The first step was purely manual labor. The kiln was choked with years of debris, fallen leaves, animal nests, and the rubbish of transient wanderers. For 2 weeks, he and Katerina hauled it all out, bucket by bucket, until they stood on the hard-packed clay floor, looking up at the rough, corbelled stone walls that spiraled 22 feet to a circular opening at the sky. He spent days just studying the stone. It was a chaotic mix of local limestone, a rubble wall 4 feet thick at the base and tapering only slightly towards the top. It was ugly, uneven, and possessed no fine masonry. But Anton saw its beauty. He ran his hand over the cool, rough surfaces. He was feeling for its substance, its weight, its density. He estimated the structure contained over 100 tons of solid stone. To a carpenter, it was a liability. To a stove builder, it was a magnificent thermal battery. His most crucial modification was at the base of the kiln, at the arched opening known as the eye, where the lime burners of old had stoked the fire. He did not simply place a stove there. Instead, he used fire brick he had carefully sourced and fieldstone he gathered himself to construct a large, deep hearth inside the arch. But this was no ordinary fireplace. With masterful knowledge of flues, he channeled the exhaust. Instead of venting straight up and out, he designed a serpentine channel of stone and clay that forced the hot smoke and gases to snake their way through the inner layer of the massive limestone wall for nearly 15 feet before exiting through a small, newly created chimney high on the kiln's flank. He was, in effect, turning the very wall of his home into a heat exchanger. The tons of limestone would be forced to absorb the immense waste heat that in a normal chimney would simply vanish into the sky. While Anton worked on the heart of his stone home, Katerina and the children undertook the next vital step. They mixed tons of lime putty, sand, and horsehair into a thick, fibrous plaster. They began troweling it onto the interior walls, forcing it into every crevice. This was not for aesthetics. The hairline plaster performed two critical functions. First, it created an airtight seal, eliminating every draft and point of infiltration. Second, it provided a clean, smooth, light-colored surface that would reflect the warmth and light back into the living space, transforming the dark, cave-like interior into a room. Mercer Halloway made his official visit in late October. He rode up, dismounted, and produced a clipboard. He saw the plaster-smeared family, the strange brickwork in the kiln's mouth, the sheer absurdity of it all. "Mr. Pirc," he began, his voice devoid of warmth, "I have a duty to inform you. This structure is on the county rolls as an abandoned industrial kiln, a ruin. It is not zoned for habitation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If you persist in treating it as a dwelling, I will be forced to assess it as such. But I will not assess it as a homestead. I will assess it as a derelict commercial property, which carries double the tax burden. Furthermore, the county board will likely issue an order forbidding occupancy on grounds of safety. It is an unsuitable structure." Jedediah Smith, who had accompanied him, chimed in. "He's telling you for your own good, Pirc. That thing will sweat and freeze. It'll be colder than a well-digger's boot. You'll kill your family." Anton wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked from Halloway's stern face to the massive wall his wife was plastering. He patted the stone beside him, a gesture of deep familiarity. "It is good stone," he said quietly. He then turned and went back to his work, leaving the two men standing in stunned silence. The conversation was over. The secret Anton Pirc knew, the principle that Halloway and Smith could not grasp, was the profound difference between insulation and thermal mass. It is a concept that governs how every object in the universe interacts with heat. Yet on the frontier, it was a matter of life and death. Let's break down the science. Heat energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, moves in three ways: conduction through direct contact, convection through the movement of air or fluid, and radiation through electromagnetic waves. A frontier cabin failed on all three fronts. Its thin walls conducted heat out rapidly. Its drafty construction allowed cold air to constantly infiltrate, creating convective loops that chilled the interior. And its cold interior surfaces did little to radiate warmth back to the occupants. Anton's kiln house worked on a completely different principle: delayed thermal release. Think of it like this: a thin wooden plank, a cabin wall, laid in the sun, gets hot to the touch almost instantly. But the moment a cloud covers the sun, the plank is cool again. It can't hold the heat. Now imagine a massive granite boulder. It takes hours in the hot sun to feel warm. It absorbs the energy slowly, deeply, but long after the sun has set, that boulder will continue to radiate a gentle warmth into the cool night air. The boulder is a thermal mass. The kiln wall was Anton's boulder. A 4-foot-thick wall of limestone has an enormous capacity to store heat. When Anton lit a fire in his specially designed hearth, he was doing more than just heating the air. The hot gases, forced through the flue channels inside the wall, were slowly charging the stone with BTUS. For the first hour, the inside surface of the wall would still feel cool. For the second and third hours, it would become lukewarm. It took 3 to 4 hours of a steady fire to fully saturate the inner 18 inches of the stone. This is the delayed part of the equation. Anton would burn a relatively small but hot fire for a few hours in the evening, using far less wood than his neighbors. He was essentially pouring heat into a 100-ton stone battery. By the time the family went to sleep and the fire burned down to coals, the real magic began. The stored heat in the limestone mass started its slow, inexorable journey back out. The entire inner surface of the kiln, all 22 feet of its curved height, became a single, massive, gentle radiator. The temperature inside did not spike and plummet like in a wooden cabin. It remained remarkably stable. While the outside temperature might swing 50 degrees from day to night, the inside of the kiln might only vary by 5 or 10 degrees. The stone acted as a colossal thermal flywheel, smoothing out the brutal extremes of the Illinois winter. The key, which Anton knew from building masonry stoves, was that the heat took more than 14 hours to travel all the way through the 4-foot wall. By the time the heat from last night's fire was reaching the outside of the kiln, he was already lighting the next evening's fire, recharging the system. It was a cycle of thermal breathing, a slow, deep rhythm of absorbing and releasing warmth that was perfectly attuned to human survival. That December, the winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, violent assault. It began with rain. A cold, persistent rain that fell for 5 straight days, but the ground and air were below freezing, and every drop froze where it landed. The landscape of the Lead Hills was transformed into a treacherous world of glass. Tree branches, heavy with accumulated ice, began to snap with reports like rifle shots. The weight on the roofs of the cabins was immense. Then, the rain stopped, the clouds vanished, and the temperature plunged. For 3 consecutive nights, it dropped to 22 degrees below zero. The extreme cold, combined with the heavy load of ice, began to break the houses of Anton's neighbors. The ridgepoles of their cabins, the main structural beams holding up their roofs, contracted violently in the cold. All across the valley, families were jolted awake by a terrifying sound, a great, cracking groan as their homes began to fail under the strain. Inside Jedediah Smith's cabin, the scene was one of grim endurance. His family was huddled around their stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The ice on the inside of the walls was a 1/4 inch thick. Every breath hung in the air as a visible cloud. They burned wood with a desperate intensity, but the cold was relentless, seeping in from every direction. The sound of his own roof groaning filled him with a primal fear. Inside the kiln there was only stillness. The shrieking of the wind outside was reduced to a distant, muffled hum, the sound of a storm happening in another country. The 4-foot stone walls were impervious to the noise and the fury. There were no drafts. A single candle on their small wooden table burned with a steady, unwavering flame. The air was not hot, not stuffy, but uniformly, pleasantly warm. The massive inner wall radiated a gentle, constant heat that felt like a mild spring sun. Luca and Anna were not bundled in coats. They played on a sheepskin rug on the plastered floor, their movements free and easy. Katerina worked at the table, humming a song from her homeland. The air was so stable and warm that she could roll out the paper-thin dough for patika, the delicate nut roll pastry that had been impossible to make in their old shack. She had a small block of butter for the filling sitting on the table. It was perfectly soft, perfectly spreadable. The scene was one of profound, impossible domesticity. Outside, the world was breaking. Inside Anton Pirc's stone house, a family was simply living, their peace secured by the quiet wisdom of the stone that surrounded them. Mercer Halloway was a man of duty. The news of cracking ridgepoles and families cut off by the ice storm had reached him, and he felt compelled to check on the outlying homesteads. He was making his rounds in a small buggy, the horse struggling for purchase on the glazed roads, when disaster struck. On the steep, icy grade directly above the Pirc's kiln, his left axle, made brittle by the extreme cold, snapped. The sharp crack echoed in the frozen air, and the buggy lurched violently, throwing him into a snowdrift. He was alive, but stranded. His horse was lame, the buggy useless. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the breath and burned the skin. He knew he was in serious trouble. Hypothermia could set in within minutes. Looking down the slope, he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible plume of smoke rising from the side of the strange stone structure. He had no choice. He would have to swallow his pride and seek help from the fool in the kiln. Getting down the hill was an ordeal. Every surface was coated in a treacherous, uneven layer of ice. He slid and stumbled, his hands and knees raw. Halfway down, he had to brace himself against the southern wall of the kiln to keep from falling. He put a gloved hand against the limestone, expecting the brutal, sucking cold of any other stone in this God-forsaken freeze. Instead, he felt nothing. Not warmth, but the complete absence of the biting cold he expected. It was deeply unsettling. He pulled off his glove, his fingers already stiffening. He placed his bare palm flat against the rough stones. They were not warm, not hot. They were simply not frozen. He looked closer, his mind struggling to process what his senses were telling him. In a great, man-tall oval, radiating out from where the hearth must be inside, the thick glaze of ice that coated every other surface was gone. The stone was dark, damp, and from its surface a faint, impossible steam rose into the minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit air. The kiln was leaking heat, but it was leaking it so slowly, so gently, that it was melting ice on its exterior hours after the fire had been banked. It was breathing warmth. Stunned, Halloway stumbled the remaining few feet to the simple wooden door and knocked. It was opened by Anton Pirc. The transition was breathtaking. Halloway stepped from a world of screaming wind and lethal cold into a pocket of absolute calm. The air was still, quiet, and suffused with a gentle, radiant warmth. He saw the two children playing on the floor, their cheeks rosy. He saw Katerina turn from a small stove, her expression calm. There was no frantic activity, no huddling, no sense of siege. Katerina offered him a hot cup of tea, which he accepted with trembling hands. As he sat at their table, trying to bring life back to his frozen limbs, his gaze fell upon the deep windowsill, a recess cut nearly 4 feet into the stone. On it sat a small, wooden butter mold, carved with an intricate flower, and next to it, the block of butter it had pressed. He stared at it. He was a practical man, an assessor who noticed details. He knew what butter looked like in his own well-built frame house this week, a cracked, warped, rock-hard thing that split and splintered when his wife tried to cut it. This butter was different. This butter had sharp edges. The delicate, embossed pattern of the flower on its surface was as crisp and perfect as the day it was pressed. It was neither rock-hard nor meltingly soft. It was simply butter. He gestured towards it, his voice raspy. "The butter," he said. "How is it not frozen solid?" Katerina smiled a little. "It is always good here," she said simply. "It is never frozen, never too soft. The walls decide." In that moment, Mercer Halloway understood. It wasn't about the heat. It was about the stability. The stone was a moderator, a great slow pendulum that smoothed out the violent swings of the world outside. It created a bubble of constancy. He looked at Anton, who was watching him with quiet, knowing eyes. All of Halloway's certitude, his belief in board feet and proper framing, his confidence in the established way of doing things, collapsed into dust. He saw not a fool, but a genius of a different order. "My God, Pirc," Halloway whispered, the words catching in his throat. "You didn't build a house. You built a summer's day and trapped it in stone." The story of Mercer Halloway's rescue and the impossible butter spread through the hills, but not in the way one might expect. Halloway was a quiet man, and he simply tore up the industrial assessment notice for the Pirc property, listing it instead as a standard homestead with a note about its unusually effective masonry. The true dissemination of the idea followed the paths of culture and craft. That spring, a cousin of Anton's, a stonemason working at the booming limestone quarries in Joliet, came to visit. He spent a night in the kiln, felt the steady warmth, and listened as Anton explained the principles not in the language of physics, but in the language of a pechar. The stonemason took the story back to the tight-knit Slovenian community in Joliet. At a Saints' Day gathering over food and music, he told the tale of Anton Pirc's stone stove house. To the carpenters and farmers who had mocked Anton, the idea was alien. But to these men who spent their days cutting, shaping, and understanding stone, it made perfect, intuitive sense. They understood its mass, its patience, its ability to hold the memory of heat. The idea was not a strange innovation, but a logical extension of their own craft. By the following autumn, 2 other Slovenian families near the town of Limont, having found their own abandoned kilns, began the process of converting them, not as an act of desperation, but as an act of profound, inherited wisdom. What Anton Pirc accomplished in the hills of Galena was more than a clever trick. With the knowledge of an ancient trade, he had built a home that was decades ahead of its time. He had intuitively grasped the principles of high-mass construction and passive thermal regulation that modern sustainable architects now champion. Concepts like the thermal battery, airtight building envelopes, and decoupling a home's interior climate from the exterior weather are now cornerstones of green design. Anton had no scientific vocabulary for these ideas, but he had something more fundamental, a deep, hands-on understanding of his materials. The other settlers in the Lead Hills saw winter as an enemy. They built thin wooden fortresses and waged a desperate, fuel-intensive war against an adversary that always, eventually, won. Their homes were symbols of a battle, places of frantic action against the encroaching cold. Anton Pirc did not fight the winter. He did not build a fortress. As a pechar, his life's work was not about fighting heat, but about understanding it, guiding it, and persuading it to linger. He approached the abandoned kiln not with an axe, but with an open ear. He listened to the 4-foot-thick limestone walls, and they told him a secret far older than any tree in Illinois, that stone does not forget the fire. He didn't build walls to keep the winter out. He simply listened to walls that already knew how to hold the memory of heat. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who appreciates forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other abandoned industrial structures like kilns or mills do you think could be ingeniously repurposed for modern living? Disclaimer. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply these or similar methods in a modern context should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.